Released at the end of 2017, the GTX 1070 Ti was one of the last enthusiast GPUs from this generation to hit the market, and it was a beast. Here you had a GPU with 8GB of VRAM at just $450, which was almost as good as a 1080, and if you overclocked it, it could definitely be considered one. The GTX 1070 Ti was, in simpler words, the best GPU during those times, in terms of cost to performance. Fast forward a little bit, and we are now in 2024, and I'm still rocking this little devil. It has been my partner in crime for almost 7 years, and it has never let me down while working or playing video games. But since the new 5000 series is just around the corner, I had a question. Is it time for an upgrade? Could this GPU of 2017 keep up with today's games? Let's take a look. First, let's start with A Plague Tale: Requiem, a game that, graphic-wise, is still amazing even though it was released 2 years ago, which isn't that long to be honest. At 1080p with everything set to ultra, sadly the game struggles, and I know people tend to say that 30 frames per second is a nice frame rate for this type of games, and here we are getting at least an average of 45 to 50 FPS, which isn't bad, but I personally think that anything below 60 is atrocious. Keep in mind that this game also has a forced upscaler, which was set to the ultra quality preset because going lower than that at 1080p is just nasty. Again, this game was known at the time for being graphically intensive, so I didn't have high hopes of being able to run it, but I'm impressed that this GPU was able to do so with this kind of numbers. I honestly was expecting something between 30 to 35 FPS as an average maybe, and I'm sure that by going from ultra to high or even medium settings, this could run even better. Apart from A Plague Tale: Requiem, Cyberpunk 2077 is an even older game that was released during 2020, and at launch it had a lot of issues, but nowadays it's a pretty nice game to play with all the patches and whatnot, but graphically it's still a hard thing to move at ultra settings. By using the in-game benchmark at 1080p with everything set to the maximum it allows, the GTX 1070 Ti is able to hit an average of 48 frames per second with a minimum of 40, which is nice, but during real gameplay this doesn't stay true, or at least it doesn't stay consistent. Because yes, it can and it will be able to hit a 45 to 50 FPS average, but at some points the performance will crawl to the 30s, which isn't that big of a deal if you can handle this frame rate, but I wouldn't call it a good experience. Again, graphics can be turned down for better frame rates, however, I don't like to do this, so yeah. And since we are talking about older games, let's go ahead with Call of Duty Warzone, which is one of the biggest battle royales that people still play and which is also graphically demanding if you push it. And let me tell you, it's almost incredible how well the 1070 Ti holds up here. At 1080p in the extreme graphics preset, the game can easily hit a constant 60 frames per second. Of course, this is the worst case scenario, because when playing a competitive game, everyone tends to lower settings since the advantage is in the response times and visual clearance, and by doing this, the game can easily hit 100 FPS. Although there's a little issue that might be really noticeable, which is the inverse spikes and the 1% loss. Some may think that this is because of the VRAM quantity, because it's almost using the 8GB it has, but sadly, this is one of the main issues of having an old card running newish games. The memory and all the internals are just not fast enough to keep up with the processing power needed to display this game at this level of quality. And if you go back, this is also noticeable in Cyberpunk 2077 and A Plague Tale: Requiem. Oh, something funny is that the system memory usage is just so dumb. Now let's look at Fortnite, which yes, is another battle royale, but it has some differences here and there, like destructible environments, cartoonish graphics, and a third-person view. As you can see, this one plays extremely well at 1080p in the Epic preset, hitting more than 100 FPS at times and maintaining a healthy frame rate between 85 to 95 FPS, which is such a contrast with Warzone's 60s. Of course, TSR is disabled because at 1080p any kind of upscaling looks horrible, so this is pure raw power being outputted. But it's not without issues, because as with Warzone, Fortnite also suffers from spikes in its frame time, and this time, VRAM quantity is absolutely not the problem here, because it's just using 5GB at most, and as you can see, these spikes are big. I mean, in theory Fortnite is using even less resources than Warzone, and yet you can see it struggling more. which is interesting and might have something to do with the fact that this game is working with a newer engine. Obviously, these games aren't that new, so it's not that hard to run them. But now let's look at the performance with Palworld. I mean, I don't know if people still play it, but I think this is a great example of a newish game with a newish engine that doesn't have that big of a budget to be able to optimize the game that much, and which is also what I like to call a TV game. You know, a game that could easily appear on a movie or a TV series as a background thing. Again, the game is played at a 1080p resolution with everything turned all the way up and without any kind of upscaler working on it. And I honestly think it plays modestly good. I mean, the performance is between 60 and 80 FPS with an average of 60, 65 maybe, and without a lot of spikes. Although something to note is that during this playthrough I didn't come across a lot of action or explosions or even buildings, so these numbers could be a little bit deceptive. Also keep in mind that the graphics could be turned down to high, medium or even low if 60 isn't cutting it. Remnant 2 is one of those games that I will never play on my own, but I thought it will be a great example of a semi-high tier game using the new Unreal Engine. With this said, the test wasn't that good. I ran this game at 1080p with everything set to ultra and it wasn't able to hit even 60 frames per second. It staggered around 40-45 FPS. I mean, it's not bad by any means, but it's not optimal either. Memory could be seen as an issue here though, since it was using around 7 gigs, but I don't think this could cause any problems, given that this card is able to output 8000 in these numbers, although, as with Warzone, the system memory usage here was just so dumb. The remake of Resident Evil 4 has been a game that I've been wanting to play for a while now, but I was afraid that this GPU couldn't handle it and I would have a miserable experience. But I'm glad to say that I was wrong. At 1080p, a GPU that is almost 80 years old was able to handle this game with all the settings turned all the way up just fine. Although I have to point out that this time the VRAM quantity was an issue, since it needed, according to its settings, 12.35 GB, and well, that's more than the 8 GB this GPU has. This usually is bad because it can make some textures pop up and have some issues here and there, but I honestly didn't see any of this during my testing, so I won't focus too much on this. Something that repeats here are the spikes though, and even though they aren't as spiky, they are more constant, and I think this is more noticeable in places like the tree you have to circumvent at the start, the room that has a wooden symbol of Las Plagas, and the pyre of the town. At first, I thought that this had to do with the VRAM, because the performance around the pyre was just awful, but even by turning down some settings, this game was spiked down. Not as bad as before, but they were still there. Something interesting to note here is that even though some settings were changed from ultra to high, this didn't really affect the frame rate that much. Overall, the game performed better than I thought. I mean, it wasn't able to give me a 60 frames per second experience, but it was damn close. However, once again, the spikes were an issue, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but in all of these games, if you have been paying attention to the frame time, it is not great. But I will talk about that in a minute. Speaking of remakes, another one that is visually demanding and that is also one that I've been wanting to play is Dead Space. But unlike with Resident Evil 4, this time the GTX 1070 Ti really struggled. With everything set to the maximum option and by using TAA instead of FSR, the game ran at an average of 40 to 50 frames per second, with it sometimes hitting 30s. Which again is not that bad, but when you have a frame time that looks like this and that hits at times 30 milliseconds or even higher, the experience becomes less than ideal. And this is why frame times are almost as important as frame rate. Because yes, you could be playing a game at 60 frames per second, but if the frame time is not good, this will feel even worse than playing at 30, because every input will take an eternity to be read and stutters will start to creep in. And once again, it's pretty interesting that the system memory usage is more than 16 gigs, although the video memory is just at 6. And for the last game, I wanted to test Starfield. I know a lot of people didn't like this game for multiple reasons, but I'm a sucker for any Bethesda release. They just have this type of open world experience that no other game has. I don't know how to describe it, and at this moment it doesn't matter. What matters is how well it runs on a 1070 Ti, and this was the fire test, given that this is an open world game developed by one of the most buggy studios out there, and the only game in this video that actually lists this GPU as the bare minimum in its requirements. And yeah, I can see why. because in the wasteland or whatever they call the outside here, the performance was bad. It could barely hit more than 30 frames per second, and at times it could even go lower, with frame time spikes that were just crazy. Like 20 milliseconds aren't good, but to have spikes of even 40 milliseconds, damn. Keep in mind that this is a 1080p native and with everything set on high, not even ultra. Although the interiors were a little bit more manageable. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a 60 FPS experience either, but it was better than barely 30, and the frame time was more fluid here too. Something to note here is that the video memory usage wasn't that high, but the system one, holy moly. For all of those saying that 16GB are fine for gaming, sorry, but you are wrong. As you can see, the GTX 1070 Ti still goes strong at 1080p. It's not perfect, it won't give you more than 100 frames per second in newer titles, and you might have to tweak some settings if you want a smooth experience. But overall, I don't think this GPU is ready for retirement yet, and I could keep using it for a while. However, 1080p is fine, but 4K is even finer. And yes, I did some tests using this GPU at 4K with these same games, and oh boy. It wasn't pretty, because almost all of the games I tested were unplayable messes with texture issues, frame rates that will make any Into the Spider-Verse animator blush, and frame times that were over 50 and sometimes even over hundreds of milliseconds. I think the only one that did alright was Fortnite and maybe Warzone, but I'm still on the fence about that one because I tested it in the balanced preset instead of the extreme one, because I'm a dummy. So easy to say, this GPU isn't made for 4K. Which I mean, it should be kind of obvious, right? Even VRAM wise, the most it could aim for is 1440p. And before you ask, yes, I could have tested these games in 1440p too just to see how well they worked at this resolution, but to me, 1440p is such a pointless middle ground that why even bother? In conclusion, if you don't own a 4K monitor, don't plan on playing any newish games at 4K, and don't mind turning some settings down with new releases, then the 1070 Ti is a nice GPU to have, and I think it still has maybe a year or two of proper life. Just keep in mind that you won't be able to use features like ray tracing, DLSS and all that. They are not that impressive, unless so if you're playing at 1080p, but it's always a plus to have. Although FSR is a thing and it works with the GPU, so you won't be missing that much. Anyways, don't forget to like and subscribe. Ciao!